Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Simply Susan, where we explore historical sewing, cooking, and living. Today, I'm going to be finally wrapping up my Regency gown and doing an official try on for all of you. This gown was one that was done as part of a collaboration with the cost community. It is called Relaxed Regency. You can find a link to the playlist in the description box down below if you want to check out some other Regency projects. So, you saw in my first two videos about this little series, I made the stays to support the historical silhouette that's proper for this time frame. And then I also made a Spencer jacket, just a really cute short little jacket to go along with this look. I'm not a huge fan of the way the sleeves are in Regency fashions, just because they're shorter, they're kind of poofy, and frankly, that's just an area that I would rather not draw more attention to by having poofy fabric. So I decided I was going to make that cute little Spencer jacket, and I am super thrilled with how that jacket came out. So that was a really great way that even if a historical outfit might not seem like it's specifically something that you would like, there were probably people of all different body types all through history that probably had some of the same concerns, and they probably found ways that they could work around it and make it something that they would like. And Sydney is coming to help me again, so you get to see her little self. But the other thing that I figured while I was just working on some of these closures to finish this up, I figured that I would just spend a couple minutes and let's talk about the Regency period. When I started this relaxed Regency project and making this Regency gown, if I'm being completely and totally honest, the only thing I knew about the Regency era is that it was the period of time that the TV series Bridgerton was set in. Now, I'm fully aware that there are some issues as far as the fashion and accuracy of the show. And that's okay by me. I still found it enjoyable. I still liked watching it. And I still found it to be just very visually appealing, just to sort of get a sense of what that time period might have looked like. Looks like I'm not allowed to sew right now. Let me see if I can get her to sit in the window. That might work. So, yeah, to be honest, that was all I knew about the Regency. I knew that that was the era of Jane Austen and some of the novels of that time, but to be honest, that was not something that I ever got super interested in and really watched a lot of. So it was something different for me, and it was something that was a little bit out of my comfort zone just because the silhouette to me is not super appealing for myself and my body type. And it was just something that I was like, I don't know if I want to do this. But then after I watched Bridgerton and after I got a little bit more of a feel for it, I was like, well, you know what? Let's see what we can do to make it something that I enjoy as well. But basically, I wanted to just talk a little bit too. What is the Regency? So a lot of the main historical time frames that you might know of or be aware of, like you've probably heard of the Victorian era, right? The Victorian era was when Queen Victoria was on the throne in England. Then there's also the Georgian era, which was the time of King George. And then another time frame that you might have heard of that came right after the Victorian era was the Edwardian era. And if you're following along, you would be right if you guessed that there was a king named Edward on the throne at the time of that era. But who was King Regent? Who? I've never heard of that name. Did you? So I looked it up. The Regency era And I have to read a little bit of this because I don't want to misspeak completely. The Regency era in the United Kingdom and the British Isles and Ireland was a period at the end of the Georgian era. So King George was the king over England when the United States broke away. If you've watched Hamilton, that's King George. And at the end of King George's reign, he became mentally ill and became mad and he was referred to as the Mad King, and he wasn't able to complete his rule. So at the end of the Georgian era, when King George III was deemed unfit to rule due to his illness, his son ruled as proxy as Prince Regent. So I guess that whenever the king was still alive, but somebody else was acting in his stead, that person would be the regent that was in charge when the king was not capable of ruling, but the king was still alive, and you couldn't just, pretend he didn't exist. You still had to, he was still the king. So the term regency can refer to various stretches of time whenever we think about what was the Regency era. And the Regency era can last the formal decade of the Regency when we had the Prince Regent ruling, which was from 1811 to 1820. But other people believe or describe the time frame of 1795 to 1837. So that's the latter part of King George III's reign, the reign of his sons George IV and William IV is also sometimes included into that time called the Regency era. During that time, we see a lot of really specific trends in fashion and architecture, and just social things happening at that time. That was also when the war was waged with Napoleon, and people were trying to sort of break away from French influences and come up with something else, do their own, do something different, and not just be influenced by what was being done in France at the time. They were trying to kind of break away from that. And the other thing, so whenever we think about the fashion of that time, I had spoken just very briefly that when I started this Regency project, that I had to create the correct undergarments for it. So one of the most important things when you are doing any kind of historical dress or trying to do any kind of historical interpretation or anything like that, you have to have the correct silhouette for the time, you'll hear people say. A lot of times people think that Victorian ladies did this horribly unhealthy and horribly painful tight lacing, and look how tiny their waists were. Well, there's a lot of research out there that actually says their waists weren't all these very tiny, 18-inch waists. There's a whole lot of other research that's out there that actually shows that a lot of times women would pad out their figure to make it the correct proportion. So if you have a little bit of padding up top and then you have a little bit of a bustle pad or something in the hips down below, your waist looks smaller and you have the correct silhouette to wear some of the fashions. So, with that said, the silhouette of the historical time is of utmost importance before the dress can even look right. With the Regency era, if we get back to what I was trying to talk about in the first place, so with the Regency era, like I said, the silhouette was one of the most important things. Women's fashions in the Regency era started to change drastically. And with this time, you will see the empire silhouette or the empire silhouette, where the bodice at the top is very closely fitted and it can accentuate certain attributes that a woman may have at the top, and it is used to enhance that. And then the waist is very high, that it just is right under the bust, and it's long and flowing and free. So the stays that were used at that time, it was not called a corset yet. The stays that were used at that time had very had a cup to it, and you could see that in my stays video if you watch that one. Had a cup to it, and they had support underneath, but there was nothing terribly compressive about these garments because they were mostly just sort of made to support what was at the top, and it didn't really much matter how tiny your waist was or anything like that. That is one of the problems with Bridgerton. Of course, in so many historical things, enter the corset trope where everybody, oh, how tight they can lace themselves down. It really wasn't like that, least of all in the Regency era. And that's just like in the very first 5 minutes of the show. But after that, things get a little bit better, in my uneducated and very humble opinion regarding the history of that. But anyway, that was just a little bit the way that the fashions were. It was a new natural style that emphasized the beauty of the body's natural lines. Clothing became lighter. You can see that with a lot of the lighter colors. And you can see that it's not as heavy with as many petticoats and sorts of things underneath. And that was a big shift in the way that the fashion was at that time as well, from the previous Georgian era and the times then that would come after that whenever we step into the times with Queen Victoria and the Victorian era. The Regency fashion also was born out of a part of neoclassical fashion, and these styles were reviving Greco-Roman art, which if you see any of the older paintings and statues, a lot of times the women were shown in more of these loose fitted flowing garments, and that was also a nod back to that time frame as well. So thank you all so very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this very little bit of an overview about Regency. What is it? What was the time in history? And why are these dresses a little bit of the way that they are? I thank you very much for joining me in this little escapade that we learned a little bit about the Regency time. I got a couple of the things sewn onto my dress that I wanted to finish it up. And in the very next video, which will be coming out very soon after this one, we will put this dress in warp speed and show the construction from the chemise to the mock-up to the bodied petticoat that I have underneath it to the final fitting of the gown with all of its underthings. So thank you for joining me. Please keep watching and subscribe to my channel. Like this video if you do, which I hope you did. Give me some feedback and be ready for the next one. We will put this on and see what it looks like. Thank you.